Welcome. My name is Paul Hill. I'm the Executive Director of the Youth and Family Institute. And the point of this presentation is to help you raise money for your ministry. We've found at the Youth and Family Institute that many congregations really struggle not only for their own personal stewardship, but also especially if they're trying to bring in a group such as ours to help them take their ministry to the next level. So we want to offer this as a free service to you. And the things you're going to learn today you can use in terms of raising money for all kinds of purposes and ministries in your congregation. This presentation is going to have 3 sections, and the first section we're going to do is on theology, because theology matters, and that's where we're going to start. In fact, if you take a look at this first slide, it always begins with theology. The number one finding of the huge study done by Dr. Raleigh Martinson and 7 different denominations on what helps congregations be effective in children, youth, and family ministry, the number one finding of that study said that theology matters. In other words, all congregations that did exemplary practices in youth ministry were congregations where God was the subject of the sentences. They all assumed that everything that they were doing was somehow connected with and related to what God was up to in their lives. Often stewardship, and especially financial stewardship, starts more with a bookkeeping or accounting mentality. And I want us to not go there quite yet. We're going to talk more about theology. Do we have a theology of scarcity or a theology of abundance? Do you have a theology of scarcity or a theology of abundance? This is usually the 2 different camps to look at financial development. A theology of scarcity says that money is like a pie, and you've only got a certain number of slices in that pie, and so you're going to slice up that pie, and everybody's kind of competing for that same piece of pie. And as a result, it turns people into gatekeepers and competitors against one another. Another way about thinking about financial stewardship and financial development in particular is a theology of abundance. And a theology of abundance uses a totally different metaphor. The metaphor is throwing a rock in a pond, and it keeps rippling out and keeps rippling out. That second metaphor is a more appropriate theologically and biblically grounded way of thinking about financial development and stewardship. Pie theologians have a tendency to become gatekeepers, and they hunker down to protect their slice, whereas ripples in the ocean theologians provide as many opportunities as possible for people to be generous. And I'm going to give you an example of that from Scripture. It's a very familiar story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We have Jesus, a boy who brings some loaves and fishes from the Gospel of John. And then we have Jesus' disciples. And read this text with me. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. Andrew said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, and what are they among so many people?" Then Jesus took the loaves and fish, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them. When they were satisfied, they gathered fragments up from the 5 barley loaves. They filled 12 baskets. In this text, we have pie thinkers and ripple thinkers. The pie thinkers are Jesus' disciples. They're whining. 6 months' wages wouldn't get this done. You can hear them kind of going, wah, wah, wah. Call us a ambulance. We can't possibly feed this whole group. And then you have Jesus' mentality, and that of the young boy. He offers what he has, or Jesus uses what he has, and it ripples out and feeds the whole crowd. In a lot of ways, this text is a metaphor of how to think about financial development. The other thing that's very important to begin as we think about this, and I've done financial development and stewardship for years, is I've noticed that church leaders often make excuses for their people because, one, they think they're poor, or they don't have enough money, or they're trying to kind of protect the gates, that sort of thinking. That's really not a very helpful way of going about doing this. In fact, in the United States, which is a country that's unique in its philanthropy, in the United States, in the history of philanthropy, per capita giving in benevolence was highest during the time of the Great Depression, whereas as our lowest per capita giving took place, especially during the booming years of the late 80s and throughout the 90s. It seems that the more money we have, the less generous we get. Our attitude then is critical to success in giving. The next slide you're looking at has 3 questions on it, and I'll invite those who are watching this on the internet to take a look at these 3 questions. You can even pause and interrupt my conversation with you and ask these 3 questions and discuss them amongst yourselves. What is your attitude towards money? How comfortable or uncomfortable are you talking about money, and why? And are you comfortable asking others for money or volunteers, and why? Let's continue. We've been exploring your attitude about money, but now let's talk a little bit about God's attitude about money. One way of getting a read on that is to note that in Scripture there's more than 600 references in Scripture about money, the abuse of money, or the use of money. And there's about 123 references to the word grace. Now, that's not the only way by which you ought to measure which is more important, but obviously God understands us pretty clearly that how we use our wealth, how we think about our wealth, is a significant commentary that runs as a theme throughout of all of Scripture. For the purposes of the internet presentation that you're watching, there are going to be some other scriptures that I'll highlight for you, and then I'd like to encourage you to sit down with your people in your congregation and take a look at these texts. But certainly Jesus' teachings in Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6 has a number of them, especially the line, "You cannot serve God and wealth." And then there is a text from Luke, again, the familiar story of the abundance of the widow's mite. And finally, I'll list 3 other texts for you to look at your leisure: the story of the rich man and Lazarus, the rich ruler, and Zacchaeus. Now, I do have to take a quick commentary on the story of Zacchaeus. It's a really frustrating Bible text to me, because Jesus invites himself basically into Zacchaeus' house. And Zacchaeus comes out at the end of that period and gives away a third of all his wealth. The writers of Scripture, in my opinion, really missed an opportunity. What exactly did Jesus say to Zacchaeus? And wouldn't that be helpful for us now if we knew what he had said? But we don't. We can only assume. What is the common denominator of all of these texts? It's this. When you start looking at financial stewardship from a theological perspective, they all point to talk about priorities: false worship or faithfulness. Now, I've been a pastor for more than 30 years, and I can tell you right now, the most deep, personal, spiritual conversations I've had with people is when I'm talking to them about their money. Because where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. All conversations about money ultimately boil down to issues of faithfulness, priorities, or idolatry. So here's my question for you as we end this first segment. Could it be we're uncomfortable talking about and asking for money because it reveals our own idolatry and or that of others? Could it be that this conversation gets so close to our core as to who we are as people that that's why we're uncomfortable going there? That ends this first segment, and after the break, we'll come back and we're going to talk about making your case and how important it is, whatever it is you're trying to raise money for, how to make a case that can stand on its own and can defend and or support what it is you're trying to raise your funds for.